On a warm summer night in June 1977, three young Girl Scouts walked into their campsite in Oklahoma, excited for the days ahead. By morning, all three were brutally murdered. The crime shocked the nation, sparked one of the largest manhunts in history, and left behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. In the summer of 1977, the Girl Scouts of America were preparing for yet another season at Camp Scott, a rustic campsite nestled in the rolling hills of Mayes County, Oklahoma. To the untrained eye, Camp Scott was a place of wonder. Hundreds of acres of forested trails, wooden tent platforms scattered across shaded clearings, and a winding creek that carved its way through the landscape. It had been used for decades to host thousands of girls who came each year to experience the outdoors, build friendships, and learn the values of teamwork and independence. But in June of that year, something far darker than campfire songs and s'mores was waiting in the shadows of Camp Scott. Three girls, each with their own hopes and dreams, would never make it back home. Their names, Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Doris Denise Milner, would forever be etched into American true crime history. Lori Lee Farmer was the youngest of the three, just 8 years old. Born in April 1969, Lori was intelligent, compassionate, and wise beyond her years. Friends described her as gentle and thoughtful, always looking out for others. Lori had been excited to join Girl Scouts, and though she was younger than most of her tent mates, her maturity and kindness made her a natural fit. Her parents remembered how she packed her bag days in advance, carefully folding her clothes and organizing her things with the precision of someone twice her age. Michelle Heather Goose, 9 years old, was the adventurous spirit of the trio. She was a bubbly, lively child, known for her love of sports and curiosity about the world. Michelle came from a close-knit family and had been counting down the days until camp began. For her, the week at Camp Scott was supposed to be an escape into the wonders of nature. Her father would later recall how excited Michelle had been to make new friends and how proud she was to be trusted with the independence of a week away from home. Doris Denise Milner, at 10 years old, was the eldest. Denise had a warm smile and a big heart, described by her teachers and friends as someone who stood up for others. Unlike Lori and Michelle, Denise was nervous about camp. She had begged her mother not to send her, pleading to stay home instead. Her mother reassured her that camp would be fun, that she would make new friends, and that she would be safe. Eventually, Denise agreed to go, though she couldn't shake a sense of unease. Tragically, her hesitation would prove to be chillingly prescient. On June 12, 1977, the girls gathered at the Girl Scouts headquarters before being transported to Camp Scott by bus. They were placed into tent units, each named after Native American tribes, a tradition of the camp. Lori, Michelle, and Denise were assigned to tent number 8 in the Kiowa unit, a clearing that sat on the far edge of camp. The Kiowa tents were arranged in a semicircle, with tent number 8 positioned farthest from the counselors' quarters, partially obscured by trees. This isolation would become a critical detail in the events that followed. The first night was stormy. Rain poured down, thunder rolled in the distance, and lightning cracked across the sky. As the counselors and campers tried to settle in, some of the girls complained about hearing strange noises outside, shuffling, footsteps, even whispers. A counselor dismissed the concerns, thinking the sounds were animals moving through the woods. But for Denise Milner, already homesick and uneasy, the night felt particularly frightening. She even wrote a letter to her mother that evening, confessing how much she wanted to come home. None of them could have known that those hours, the rain, the uneasy whispers, the sense of being watched, were not just nerves or bad weather. They were the opening act of a tragedy that would shatter countless lives and haunt an entire community for decades. The stage was set, the storm had passed, and as dawn approached, the darkness that had settled over Camp Scott was only just beginning to reveal itself. June 12th melted into June 13th, 1977, under a sky heavy with rain and thunder. By nightfall, Camp Scott had gone quiet. The counselors had completed evening activities, the girls had eaten dinner in the mess hall, and the storm had driven everyone into their tents early. In tent number 8, tucked farthest away in the Kiowa unit, Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner settled into their sleeping bags. The rain pattered steadily against the canvas above, mixing with the sound of frogs and crickets outside. For most children, it was the kind of night that lulled them into a safe, deep sleep. But for Denise, the sense of unease she had carried from home lingered. She wasn't comforted by the storm. She wasn't distracted by the chatter of the other girls. In fact, she had begged her counselor earlier that evening if she could call her mother. But phones weren't available, and she was reassured again, everything will be fine. What no one knew was that someone was already lurking in the darkness, moving silently through the woods that bordered the camp. Earlier that evening, some girls in the Kiowa unit had complained to their counselors about noises. They swore they heard movement outside the tents, footsteps, whispers, even the sound of a low chuckle. The counselors, tired and dismissive, assumed it was nerves or animals. After all, the camp was surrounded by Oklahoma wilderness. Raccoons, coyotes, and stray dogs were common. But there had also been another detail, one that haunted counselors for years to come. In the weeks leading up to camp's opening, staff members had found disturbing notes left in a box of donuts, threatening that 3 girls would be killed. The notes were brushed off as a cruel prank, but in hindsight, those words read like a prophecy. At some point between 2 and 4 a.m., the serene quiet of the camp was shattered. Investigators later pieced together that someone, possibly more than one person, slipped into tent number 8. The canvas flap was unzipped, and the intruder entered while the girls slept. Whether they awoke immediately or were startled into confusion remains unknown. What is known is that inside that tent, the girls endured something unimaginably brutal. Lori Farmer and Michelle Goose were assaulted and bludgeoned. Their small bodies later found bound and beaten. Denise Milner, still alive after the initial attack, was dragged outside into the woods. She was sexually assaulted and strangled. For the rest of the camp, the night continued without alarm. The storm covered much of the noise, and the isolated position of tent number 8 shielded it from easy visibility. The counselors in their tents were only about 150 feet away, but no one came running. When the storm subsided near dawn, the killer, or killers, made their final move. The bodies of the 3 girls were carried from the tent and laid near a trail leading toward the showers. Sleeping bags were used to drag them across the ground, leaving trails that investigators would later follow. By sunrise, the deed was done. The girls lay lifeless, the camp was still, and the killer had vanished back into the trees. At approximately 6 a.m., a camp counselor made the routine walk toward the showers. That's when she saw something that would forever scar her memory. There, partially concealed by sleeping bags, were the small, lifeless forms of Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner. The counselor screamed and chaos erupted. Some staff tried to shield the other girls from the scene, while others sprinted to call authorities. But it was too late. The nightmare had already unfolded, and the once joyful, innocent grounds of Camp Scott had transformed into a crime scene. The camp was evacuated within hours, buses rushing frightened girls back to their families. Parents who had just hugged their daughters goodbye a day earlier were now terrified, desperate for news. And for 3 families, the nightmare had already become permanent. The attack was swift, savage, and without mercy. It was not just a tragedy, but a crime so disturbing that it shattered the trust of an entire community. The very idea of children being harmed in their safe haven was unthinkable. And yet, in the early hours of June 13, 1977, that unthinkable horror became real. And as investigators soon realized, this was only the beginning of one of the most infamous and controversial murder investigations in American history. The moment authorities were called to Camp Scott on the morning of June 13, 1977, the scene that greeted them was nothing short of horrifying. The innocence of summer camp was shattered by the reality of a brutal crime, and investigators knew immediately that this case would not be simple. Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI agents, sheriffs, and local police descended upon the camp. The area near tent number 8 was quickly cordoned off, but in those critical early hours, mistakes were already being made. Counselors and staff had rushed through the crime scene, inadvertently stepping over evidence and even moving some of the items in shock. The bodies of Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner lay near the trail to the showers, still inside or partially covered by their sleeping bags. The sheer brutality stunned even seasoned investigators. Lori and Michelle had been bludgeoned, their small faces nearly unrecognizable, while Denise had clear signs of sexual assault and strangulation. The crime was not only vicious but deliberate. Inside tent number 8, the horror continued. Blood stained the canvas walls and floor, and investigators discovered evidence of bindings, likely from rope. A single flashlight with a missing cover was found near the scene, later believed to have been used by the killer. The tent flap's zipper showed signs of being tampered with, indicating someone had unzipped it carefully, perhaps to avoid waking the girls immediately. What stood out most were the drag marks in the mud. They led from the tent directly to the spot where the girls' bodies had been found. It was as though the killer had intended to stage the bodies in a specific location. Nearby, investigators also discovered a crowbar, duct tape, and rope, all believed to be linked to the attack. Curiously, there were large boot prints in the mud, far too big to belong to any of the girls or staff. And further into the woods, a small cave-like hideout was found. Inside were newspapers, photographs, and food wrappers, suggesting that someone had been living nearby in the days or even weeks before the murders. This discovery fueled a chilling theory. The killer may have been stalking the camp for days, watching the children before making his move. When investigators learned of the threatening note left weeks earlier in the box of donuts, warning that 3 girls would die, the case took on an even darker significance. Was this simply a coincidence, or had the camp ignored a direct warning? Many parents would later hold Camp Scott accountable for failing to take the threat seriously. News of the murders spread like wildfire across Oklahoma. Parents who had sent their daughters to camp were frantic, and many rushed back to collect them. For the families of Lori, Michelle, and Denise, the grief was indescribable. They had trusted Camp Scott with their children's safety, only to have them returned in the most tragic way possible. Law enforcement faced immense pressure. The public demanded answers, and rumors began swirling. Some believed this was the work of a serial killer. Others feared it was tied to cult activity or a drifter passing through the area. Within days, investigators developed their prime suspect, Jean Leroy Hart, an escaped convict with a history of violence and sexual assaults. Hart had grown up in the same area and was familiar with the woods surrounding Camp Scott. Even more chilling, he had previously been convicted of kidnapping and raping 2 pregnant women, leaving them bound and gagged in the woods. Hart had escaped prison in 1973 and had been on the run for 4 years by the time of the murders. Locals whispered that he was being hidden by members of the Cherokee community who viewed him with sympathy and distrust of the justice system. With Hart on the run and suspicion mounting, the manhunt became one of the largest in Oklahoma history. The investigation was in motion, but it was already clear mistakes, community tension, and a lack of forensic technology would complicate every step. The truth about who killed the three Girl Scouts and why was far from clear. The murders of Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner had shocked the nation, but amid the chaos of Camp Scott and the wave of panic gripping Oklahoma, investigators began to zero in on one name, a man whose past crimes made him a chilling suspect. His name was Gene Leroy Hart. Hart wasn't just any fugitive. He was a convicted rapist, burglar, and kidnapper with a disturbing history of violence. Years earlier, he had kidnapped and sexually assaulted two pregnant women. He bound them with duct tape, blindfolded them, and left them to die in the woods. By sheer luck, they survived. Hart was caught and sentenced, but in 1973, while serving time at the Mays County Jail, he managed to escape. For the next 4 years, he lived as a fugitive, reportedly hiding deep within the rugged Cherokee Nation territory of Oklahoma. Many believed he was being sheltered by locals who distrusted the authorities and saw Hart as a symbol of defiance against the system. When the Girl Scout murders occurred in June 1977, Hart immediately rose to the top of the suspect list. His past crimes, sexual assault, violence against women, and leaving victims in the woods mirrored the brutality at Camp Scott. The evidence found near the crime scene, including duct tape and rope, was strikingly similar to methods Hart had used before. But naming Hart as the prime suspect wasn't without controversy. In the Cherokee community, many considered Hart a victim of racial prejudice and systemic injustice. They didn't believe he was capable of such a heinous crime, and they accused law enforcement of scapegoating him simply because of his heritage and criminal past. This created deep tension. One side saw Hart as a violent predator who had finally escalated to murder. The other saw him as a man wrongfully accused in a case fueled by public hysteria. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in Oklahoma history. Law enforcement officers, OSBI agents, and even the FBI scoured the woods, caves, and rural homes across Mays County. Hart seemed to vanish into the wilderness, but rumors persisted that locals were hiding him, providing food and shelter to keep him beyond the reach of the law. Months turned into years, but in April 1978, investigators finally tracked Hart down. Acting on a tip, they raided a small shack hidden deep in the Cherokee Nation hills. Hart was captured without resistance, bringing a wave of relief and renewed tension to the community. In 1979, Hart finally went to trial for the murders of the three Girl Scouts. The prosecution laid out a case that seemed damning: Hart's violent past, his proximity to the camp, and evidence tying him to the crime. Forensic testing linked hair and bodily fluids found at the scene to Hart, though the technology of the time was crude and far from definitive. The defense countered by highlighting flaws in the investigation. They argued that evidence had been mishandled, contaminated, or planted. They painted law enforcement as desperate to convict someone, anyone, to calm public outrage. The earlier threatening note about the three girls dying also raised suspicion. Had the murders been premeditated by someone other than Hart? In the end, the jury shocked the courtroom. Despite the public belief in Hart's guilt, he was acquitted of the murders in 1979. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Families of the victims were devastated, while Hart's supporters celebrated. Although acquitted of the Girl Scout murders, Hart's freedom was short-lived. He was sent back to prison to serve out his previous sentences for rape, kidnapping, and burglary. Just months later, in June 1979, Hart collapsed and died of a heart attack while jogging in the prison yard. For many, his death closed the chapter on his possible involvement. For others, it only deepened the mystery. If Hart had truly been guilty, had justice been served, or had the real killer gone free while the state pursued the wrong man? Hart's story left a permanent mark on the Girl Scout murders case. To this day, some believe he was the true killer, while others argue the evidence was too weak and circumstantial. Modern DNA testing decades later provided partial matches between Hart's genetic profile and the evidence found, but the results were not strong enough to give closure. The name Jean Leroy Hart remains forever tied to the tragedy at Camp Scott, either as the killer who escaped justice or as a man wrongfully accused of one of the most horrific crimes in American history. When Jean Leroy Hart was finally captured in April 1978 after years on the run, the stage was set for one of the most highly publicized trials in Oklahoma history. The murders of Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner had left the entire nation horrified, and by the time Hart was brought to court in 1979, public opinion was already deeply divided. On one side were those convinced Hart was a violent predator whose past crimes made him the only possible suspect. On the other were those who believed he was being railroaded by desperate investigators eager for a conviction. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of Hart as the man responsible for the Camp Scott murders. They leaned heavily on his criminal history, a convicted rapist, kidnapper, and burglar who had assaulted 2 women years earlier and abandoned them in the woods, bound and blindfolded. They argued that the brutality of those crimes was eerily similar to the murders of the Girl Scouts. Forensic evidence was also presented. Hair found at the crime scene was said to match Hart's characteristics. Seminal fluid evidence suggested that the perpetrator had the same blood type as Hart. Pieces of duct tape and rope, consistent with items Hart had previously used in his crimes, were shown to the jury. To the prosecution, it was clear. Hart's violent past, his fugitive status, and the physical evidence pointed directly to him. But the defense was equally relentless. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, weak, and possibly contaminated. The hair match, they noted, was based on crude forensic techniques of the 1970s that could not conclusively identify Hart. The blood type evidence was not unique. It matched a large portion of the population. More importantly, they raised questions about the handling of evidence. Some items, they claimed, were left unsecured or improperly documented. Others suggested that law enforcement, under intense public pressure to solve the crime, might have manipulated or even planted evidence to ensure Hart's conviction. The defense also emphasized Hart's supporters in the Cherokee community. Many believed Hart was a victim of systemic racism, targeted not because of irrefutable proof, but because he was an easy scapegoat, an escaped prisoner with a dark past who fit the narrative investigators wanted. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that this was more than just a criminal case. It was a cultural battle. News outlets swarmed the courtroom, and every development was splashed across national headlines. Outside, protesters and supporters gathered, some demanding justice for the murdered children, others calling for fairness and due process. The families of the victims sat through the proceedings, forced to listen to harrowing details of their daughter's final hours, while also watching the case against Hart grow shakier. It was agony. Every parent wanted answers, but the trial seemed to raise more questions than it answered. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its decision. In a stunning moment that sent shockwaves through the courtroom, Jean Leroy Hart was acquitted of all charges in the Girl Scout murders. Gasps, sobs, and shouts erupted. For the victims' families, it was devastating. For Hart's supporters, it was vindication. Though acquitted, Hart was immediately returned to prison to serve out the rest of his previous sentences for rape, kidnapping, and burglary. Just months later, in June 1979, he died of a heart attack while jogging in prison. Hart's trial remains one of the most controversial in U.S. criminal history. Some point to his violent past, partial DNA matches decades later, and circumstantial evidence as proof that justice slipped away. Others argue that the trial revealed deep flaws in law enforcement's handling of the case, with too many uncertainties to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt. The result was a tragedy within a tragedy. Not only had 3 young girls been brutally murdered, but the trial meant to deliver closure, instead deepened the mystery. To this day, the question lingers: did the real killer die with Jean Leroy Hart, or did he walk free, his identity forever hidden in the shadows of Camp Scott? The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remain, even after decades, one of the most haunting and unresolved cases in American history. For the families of Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Denise Milner, the pain never truly ended. Their daughters had gone to Camp Scott in June 1977 expecting adventure, friendship, and laughter, only to have their young lives stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. What followed was not just grief, but a lifetime of unanswered questions. Questions that the justice system never managed to resolve. Camp Scott, once a place where countless girls had built happy childhood memories, was shuttered forever after the murders. Its cabins fell silent, its trails overgrown. For the community of Locust Grove and the wider world of scouting, the camp became a symbol of shattered innocence. Even today, locals describe the site with a sense of dread and melancholy, as though the land itself still carries the weight of what happened that night. Parents across America began to look at summer camps differently. A place once thought safe, filled with campfires and songs, was suddenly seen as vulnerable. The tragedy changed how camps handled security, supervision, and even how children were prepared for overnight trips. The murders didn't just scar families, they shifted a cultural perception of childhood safety. Despite Jean Leroy Hart's trial and acquittal, suspicions never disappeared. Later advances in DNA testing suggested that evidence from the crime scene showed partial matches to Hart's profile, but the results were inconclusive. Was Hart truly the killer, or had investigators focused so narrowly on him that they ignored other possibilities? Was Hart guilty and simply acquitted due to mishandled evidence? Could someone else have been involved, perhaps even multiple perpetrators? Did law enforcement mistakes and contamination ensure that the truth would remain buried forever? These questions echo endlessly, leaving a sense of unfinished justice. For the victims' families, the lack of clarity has been one of the cruelest aspects of the tragedy. The Girl Scout murders have been the subject of books, documentaries, and podcasts, each re-examining the case in the hope of finding new clues. The story continues to fascinate and horrify because it touches on universal fears: that the innocent can be taken, that safe spaces can be violated, and that sometimes justice does not prevail. For Oklahomans, the case has become a somber part of state history, a wound that never fully healed. Generations have grown up hearing about Camp Scott, the 3 girls, and the mystery that still surrounds their deaths. It's a chilling reminder of how a single night of violence can alter the course of countless lives and leave an entire community searching for answers. Decades later, the case is still considered open. Law enforcement occasionally revisits the evidence with modern technology, hoping that one day a conclusive breakthrough will emerge. But until then, the murders of Lori, Michelle, and Denise remain unsolved, an open wound in the American criminal record. The true legacy of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders is twofold. It is a story of unimaginable loss, but also of enduring memory. The girls' names are still spoken, their faces still remembered. Communities continue to honor them, ensuring they are not forgotten even as their killer remains unknown. And so the unanswered questions linger like shadows in the Oklahoma night. Who truly committed this crime? Was justice denied, or was it never within reach? Will the truth ever come to light, or has it been lost to history forever?